Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this month's Power BI Dev Camp by Ted Patterson, our Principal Program Manager here at Microsoft. Today we'll be going through developing with .NET 5 and App Owns Data Embedding. My name's Kelly Kay and I'm a Community Engagement Lead here at Microsoft. In today's call, we've just got a couple of housekeeping reminders. In our meeting today, we ask that everybody is aware of others, be aware of others, be friendly and patient, be welcoming and respectful, be open to all questions and viewpoints, be understanding of differences, and be kind and considerate to others. Our Q&A will be in the chat. The recording will be available in about a week's time, and you can check out our Power BI blog and our Power BI community posts for updates to that. And with that, let's hand it over to the amazing Ted Patterson.
Welcome everybody to our session today. Maybe just for starters, just let me point out we have a little convenience portal we put together for our sessions here. So for instance, today's session is going to be our 7th session, and as you go to the portal, some of the things we point out here in the link section are things such as downloading the student manual for the tutorial associated with this session, finding the slides, some other demo applications I'll reference, are all here that you can find. Okay, now in our session today, let's just kind of start by getting an application up and off the ground, and we're going to use the latest and greatest with .NET, which is .NET 5. We're going to stand up an application that authenticates the user, and we're going to call to the Power BI service. However, we're going to do everything under the App Owns data model. Okay, now just a little bit of background, so everyone understands the difference between two different embedding models that we have. So we have one which is called User Owns Data Embedding, and in that case, you as an application developer have to authenticate the user and then acquire user-based access tokens from Azure AD. And then when you call to the Power BI service to implement Power BI embedding, you do so under the identity and with the permissions of the current user. Now, one big downside to this scenario, to this approach for many scenarios, is every user requires a Power BI license, and therefore it also requires an Azure AD organizational account, what you might call a work and school account. And so for many scenarios, that doesn't cut it. We have users, and imagine we have a custom portal and we have our own hand-rolled identity provider. Maybe we just keep our usernames and passwords in a SQL database. Maybe we use something other than Azure AD for identity management and maintaining our user accounts. So then we move to App Owns data. And the idea is that when the app authenticates and calls to the Power BI service, it does so as the application, as the service principal, and it has to do so because the application is not really telling Power BI anything about who the users are. Now, your app or your service principal, we're going to see is going to run with some pretty powerful permissions. Typically at the workspace level, you configure it as an admin member or some other type of member. And also, we never pass an Azure AD access token back to the browser. Instead, we're going to generate something which is known as an embed token. Now, the big picture with App Owns data embedding, I show this slide a lot as I introduce Power BI embedding. But now if we look at it from the perspective of App Owns data embedding, when the user accesses your application, it's up to you to authenticate your user. The big benefit is there. The big benefit is that you can use any authentication provider that you want. The downside is that you're going to have to provide more code to authenticate the user. And then once we authenticate the user, we have to decide why different users have different permission levels. And typically that's hand rolled. Now you're going to call into Azure AD and authenticate as the application itself. It's what we call client credentials flow, and we get an access token. And then we call into the Power BI service as service principal. And then for any Power BI workspace, which your application has been configured, in its membership as either a admin or a member, it's able to call in and get information about things like reports. And then also another big part about App Owns data embedding is when we pass all the data back to the browser, we can never pass an Azure AD access token. Instead, we call into the Power BI and we generate what's called an embed token. So the big difference is the embed token is generated by the Power BI service, where typically Azure AD access tokens are generated by the Azure AD service. Now, once we get all the data back to the browser, well, now we're able to use a client-side API known as the Power BI JavaScript API, and we take the embedding data and we take the embed token and we make a method call. And what happens is that JavaScript API has code, and kind of the deep plumbing is such that it creates an iframe, and then in a DOM event, it's able to kind of push the embed token inside the iframe, and then it's able to create a direct connection to the Power BI service. Okay, now as you go through this tutorial, and for some of you, you might like just to kind of look at the instructions and nothing makes sense to you until you write the code and see it working. And some other people might just want to open the solutions and run them. So either one is possible. But if you follow the instructions, you're going to download a bunch of sample code. So for instance, as you're going through the lab itself, let me jump over to the solution files here. If you're told to, copy and paste some code, everything is available, over here. Just because copying and pasting out of a PDF file, isn't all that fun sometimes. Okay, now let's go ahead and get moving through this first section. So another thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be using app owns data. Now we're going to create an Azure AD application, but there's something a little bit that could be confusing unless you fully understand what's happening. So one of the big benefits of app owns data is it doesn't require Power BI licenses. Therefore, you don't have to use Azure AD as an authentication provider. However, it doesn't prevent you from using Azure AD as an authentication provider. So in our tutorial, we're going to create a new Azure AD application. It's going to be used to authenticate users. So I can tell the difference between the anonymous user and an authenticated user, but we will not be acquiring user-based access tokens and calling to the Power BI Service API under the identity of users. Instead, we're going to be acquiring app-only tokens. So in some other scenarios, you might not be using Azure AD for user authentication, but the same principles are going to apply. Now, once again, every time we call into the Power BI Service API, it's going to do so using service principal identity. Now, just a quick flashback. If we go back 2 years ago, before we had service principal support, app owns data embedding was generally implemented with a master user account. And things are very different with user accounts as opposed to service principal. So we're not really going to discuss master user here, but just I will say that it's something we definitely recommend you move away from. If you're doing app owns data embedding, we really should be using service principal. Okay, now in the exercise flow, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be exercise 1, create a new Azure AD application. Exercise 2, we're going to create a new developer project. We're going to use .NET 5 and create an application. And what's kind of neat is that we're going to generate an application that already has code built into it to authenticate the user. Then we're going to move through the steps of calling the Power BI Service API, working on the client side and embedding the report with JavaScript. In exercise 5, we're going to move from JavaScript to TypeScript. So now we can get strongly typed programming, over on the client side. And then exercise 6, we'll do something more sophisticated with a view model. Okay, so first thing, let's say that I'm going to go back to these files that we give you as a user. And so the first thing that we're going to have you do, is to run this PowerShell script, which is going to call new Azure AD application. Now you can create the Azure AD application by hand, but also if you automate it by creating a PowerShell script, it's going to be a lot easier for you in development and deployment scenarios. Now this thing is going to have a name, and so I've already got one configured that I'm going to use for most of my demos. But let's say I just kind of create one with a display name of AAA, BBB, CCC. But the idea is that you're going to then run this script. There is going to be a PowerShell library for Azure AD that you're going to need. So tedp at powerbi dev camp.net. is my tenant. And now once we put the password in here, it should be able to run this particular script, create the Azure AD application. And what's kind of nice about the PowerShell script is then you don't have to go to Azure AD and dig out the GUIDs for things like the client ID or the client secret. You know, my script automatically gets those and provides them for you. Okay, now if I did a quick test here, you know, for instance, let's say we go back and we look at Azure AD, and now we kind of look at the application that was just created. You know, you can see that the application, you know, has a client ID, application ID. It has a tenant GUID. You know, also, when you authenticate as a service principal, you know, let's go to certificates and secrets, and you can see that it's already created a client secret, you know, and that is basically, you know, already added, you know, into this configuration file for you. So really, I'm just showing you this application to see what it looks like, but there's nothing extra we actually have to do here. And what's kind of nice is when we create the application, we're just going to be able to take this JavaScript or this JSON file and copy and paste it, you know, into the application settings file. Okay, now let's keep going and finally get up and going. You know, so if you do the tutorial, it walks you through installing the necessary software, which is Visual Studio Code, the .NET 5 SDK. Okay, and then what's going to happen is you're going to run this .NET new command. Now, let's say that I have a open, let's go back here, dev camp, app owns data. You know, so at this point, you know, we have just a open folder, you know, with nothing in it. Okay, and so what I want to show here is that, you know, here I am working with the terminal. And, you know, as I open up the terminal here, we're going to type in this .NET. And once again, let me I jumped in the wrong thing. Okay, Ted, stop confusing everyone. Okay, back to this application here. Okay, what I'm trying to kind of show is that, you know, we're going to run this simple command. So it is .NET new, and that's use the .NET command line in .NET 5 to create a new application. We're going to use a application template of MVC, and then we're going to specify for auth, you know, we want to use single org. And the idea is that this will build in code to automatically authenticate the user, you know, using a very standard pattern in .NET 5. And notice that when you create this, there is an appsettings.json file, you know, for that application. Okay, now the idea is that I'm going to now kind of move over to a different folder here and kind of open a solution. So I'm not kind of going along here, but I can move a little bit faster here. But, you know, what I am going to do is, let's say I close that. And I am now going to go ahead and I'm just going to open the solutions. And once again, with the solutions, you know, you can kind of just take that file that got generated and copy and paste that, you know, into the directory. So in our case right here, let's start with exercise 2. I'm going to open that up. And we're going to run this application in just a second, but just to kind of see where all the pieces land, you're going to basically take this configuration information. So the .NET application knows how to authenticate the user. We're then going to go through, you know, building the files that we need to run and debug the application. The lab instructions kind of take you through that. Once you've created the application, it turns out that if you want to keep working with Visual Studio Code, that's great. If you'd rather open it with Visual Studio 2019, you know, that works fine too. There are some things you really need to do at the command line, you know, but once the application you know, has been generated, either tool, you know, works just fine. It just depends on which one you like better. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is this library that provides a basis for authenticating users. Okay, and the idea of this library is that it provides a lot of code to make more of the authentication process transparent to us, the developer. So Microsoft.Identity.Web came out in November, you know, of 2020, just a couple of months ago. That's when it went GA. And it does the same thing as Microsoft.identity.client does. Some of you might be using that, but it does more. It does a lot more of the advanced user authentication work. But in general, we're going to use it to authenticate the user, to acquire access tokens. And I can acquire either user-based access tokens or service principal-based access tokens. And then also, there's a big benefit that this library is going to add in token caching, so I don't have to spend any time writing that type of code. Now, if we keep going here, when should we use Microsoft.identity.web? You need at least .NET 3.1. So anytime you're building .NET 3.1 or .NET 5, this is the library you should use if you're building either a web application or a web API. Okay, now, here's kind of the basics of once you've created that application, and if I kind of jump back to, here's kind of the solution for Lab 2, you're going to see that as the application starts up, inside of the startup.cs file, there's automatically code that was added to configure this authentication service, that is provided by Microsoft.identity.web. Now, let's go ahead and as you get to the end of the Lab 2, you should be able to authenticate, and you're also going to do things, such as add things in the UI to differentiate between the anonymous user and the authenticated user. Okay, and one more thing, let's go back to the slide here. Note that this code is added automatically for you. But then what you're going to do is you're going to go to the partial view that defines the user menu. And, we want to point out that this library, has certain endpoints, Microsoft.identity/account/signout/sign-in. And what I mean by that is, if we go to this application and we bring up our little buddy Fiddler, and this user comes in here, and now kind of the user does a sign in and a sign out. One of the things that we can see here, and let me go to filters. I just realized I need to turn this off for you to kind of see the effects. But what's going to happen when a user clicks sign in right here? And what you can see here is it's simply redirecting, the user, into something that has, Microsoft identity.account.signin. So this library automatically, registers, these endpoints with your application. So now we can allow the user to sign in. Okay, that works great. Remember, we're not going to do anything with the user identity other than establish the user is not an anonymous user at this point. But also, the application is going to give us the ability for a user to sign out. And then also, let's say that I want to go to this route right here. The other thing we point out in this lab step is that if you have the home page, you might want to, allow anonymous access there. Okay, and then for the embed endpoint, we won't allow anonymous access. So what's really neat is that if a user is at your home page and they're not authenticated, but they click on your secure route, it's automatically going to prompt them to authenticate. And then after they authenticate, it will take them to that particular page. Okay, now let's keep going through here. Now you've kind of seen, the way that, those things work. Let's go ahead and talk about calling to the Power BI service. Now, the Power BI service is very important. It is the endpoint in the cloud, the API that we call into to do things in Power BI, such as automate publishing a PBX file. I want to take a data set and I want to point it from Azure SQL Server Database 1 to Database 2, or I want to update data source credentials. So there's lots that we can do with it. And certainly the Power BI Service API is important to us because we need embedding information about reports and dashboards. And then it's also what we use to generate embed tokens. Now, here's where if you haven't programmed with Service Principal, things are going to change. So the way that access works with users is that users need permissions. And so when you get an access token, you have to make sure it has the right delegated permissions inside. When we deal with service principals, it has nothing to do with permissions. It has to do with, first of all, whether you've enabled your tenant to support service principals accessing the Power BI Service API. And second, whether your service principal has been added to a workspace, as a member. And this design was very much put in place so that a service principal wasn't given unfettered access to every workspace in the joint, but the IT staff could say this service principal has access to this workspace or this set of workspaces and cannot see anything else. Okay. Now, when you set up, one of the things that we're going to do is you're going to create a Azure AD group. And just to kind of, walk through this just so it's kind of obvious, we're going to start by going to Azure AD, and we're going to create this group. And I've created a group, and the group I'm going to have you create in your lab is just called Power BI Apps. Now, once we've created that group, the next thing that we need is we need to go up into the Power BI portal. So what I'm going to do here is let's go ahead and now we'll go move to the admin portal. Once we move to the admin portal, we are going to go to tenant settings, and then down tenant settings, the idea is that we're going to find developer settings and allow service principal to use Power BI Service API. So by default, this is turned off. By default, no service principal can call the Power BI Service API. And a key point here is that you need a friend who's either the global tenant admin or has, permissions where they're in the role of Power BI Service Administrator to flick this switch right here. So if you don't have that control over your tenant, you can't get service principal, working. I've seen that's a reason why some people still use the master user account, because the master user account, doesn't require this one-time, setting. Now, once you've got this Azure AD group, the next thing that we do is we go to this group, and the idea is that any entity inside this group, now has permissions to call the Power BI Service API. So we're going to go ahead and add the service principal here. And then the final step is that a service principal, has no built-in permissions to see a workspace. So either through code or PowerShell or manually, we're going to go and we're going to basically set, that particular app. You kind of saw me add the app before. You can kind of see that we can, find the app by whatever the name is. And remember, the two different levels that are supported for this are admin and member. Conceptually, you might think, I just want to add the service principal as a viewer, so it only has read capabilities. But I have to say that we don't support contributor or viewer, just we haven't gone through all the testing on those. So the two levels that are supported is adding your service principal as an admin, it has full control, or as a member, it has full control except for user management. Okay, and once we got those pieces, okay, now we can go ahead and move on, and figure out, how to call. Now, remember that when you create your app, there's no redirect URL that's necessary if you're just doing service principal authentication. Remember that redirect URLs only matter in user authentication. In your lab, you're going to have a redirect URL because we're also authenticating users. Okay, and then also we need a client secret or certificate. And remember that if you have an app, okay, I'll just push this one more time and then I'll drop it. If we've created this app and now we have this app and I go to API permissions, you don't need to do anything here. There's nothing about adding app permissions that will give a service principal any access, and that is true. Whether you add delegated permissions or application permissions, they will do nothing. So with service principal access, it's nothing to do with permissions. Okay, I think I've beaten a dead horse enough on that one. Let's now keep going. And so once you've got things set up, we want to call the Power BI Service API. Now, there are two ways to call the Service API, and one is to make direct HTTP calls. Now, if you are using some framework other than .NET, you might have to do this. If you're using .NET, you could program in terms of HTTP client and HTTP request message, and it's some low-level work about preparing HTTP calls, executing them, looking at the responses, taking JSON and converting it back and forth, between JSON and strongly typed C# objects. If you're using .NET, what's nice is we can use what's called the Power BI .NET SDK. So for instance, if you were just slugging it out, by making HTTP calls yourself and writing code like that, and then you move over to the .NET SDK, all of a sudden it feels like, this is so much better. And the idea is that it abstracts away making HTTP calls, it abstracts away converting the JSON data, to and from, the C# object format that you like working with. Now, let's look at some examples. In exercise 3, what you're going to do is you're going to go through this process of adding support to Microsoft.identity.web, to be able to generate access tokens. And the way that you're going to do that, in fact, let's go ahead and move over here. So in this case, I'm going to open a new project. Now I'm going to go to the solution for Lab 3. And what we're going to do here is, first of all, we're going to add a little bit more code. So the first thing just kind of sets up the service for authentication. But now we're going to flick a switch to say we'd actually like to acquire access tokens. And the way that I'm going to have you do it in the lab is specifically for service principal. So the idea is that once you've kind of called in and said enable token acquisition to downstream API, now what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom class, which is the Power BI API class. And the way that .NET Core works is you've kind of configured this token acquisition service. And so the way that you then use it from a custom class is you create a constructor and you use dependency injection to pass a parameter based on that class. And the idea is that, hey, now I've got a reference to the token acquisition service, inside my class. This gets to be a little bit tough if you're dealing with user tokens, because you have to worry about what are the permissions I want in my access token. For a service principal token, you're just going to say, give me a token with the default permission scopes. And now I've got my token. And then we'll just add a little bit of code. When I program with this friendly wrapper, which is the .NET or the Power BI .NET SDK, we work in terms of a Power BI client. Okay, so now what we have is we have kind of built an infrastructure so that I can now call to the Power BI Service API, using my friendly Power BI client. Now, in Lab 3, we're going to be a little bit contrived, and we're going to hard code a GUID for the workspace and target report. Okay, but let's say that we go ahead and we have a report that we want to embed to, and as you go through the lab, let's say I go back here and I open a lab. Notice that if you open a report just in the service, you can get the GUIDs, of the workspace and the GUID of the report. Okay, so in Lab 3, once again, what we're going to have you do is to be able to, let's see if we can single step through this. Let's go ahead, put this in place right here. Let's go ahead and start up the application. And with the application started, we're going to go ahead and the user will authenticate. Great. And now I'd like to go ahead and get the embedding. So now we can kind of see, what our code is going to look like right here. So I go ahead and I create GUIDs and I call my get report method inside here. As I call get report, I get that particular client. Once I've got that particular client right here, we're going to keep going down here. And now we're going to make this call. Let's go ahead here and remove everything there. Now let's go ahead and make that call. And what we should be able to see is, here's the call that we just made, across the network. And what did I want to get? I want to get data about one report, and there's things like the data set ID in the embed URL, that we need inside here. Okay, and then we're going to turn around, and our second chore right here is to now get the embed token. So now we're going to say generate new token request, and notice that my level is view. And now as I go ahead and we make the call, across the network, we should see that, here's the call. And if you're not using the .NET SDK, but you're just doing raw calls yourself, you have to kind of figure out how to put these URLs together, and also, how to kind of create the body for the JSON, to create an embed token as a post request. Okay. So now you've seen that, let's go ahead and hit the F5 key just to continue. But when you get to the end of exercise 3, all we're trying to do is call the Power BI Service API as service principal, get back the important data that we need to the browser. We're not going to implement it in the browser until exercise 4, but I just kind of have you show it in the table. But, here's the pertinent data, to be able to embed our report. Okay, now, as we keep going through here, what you can see here is I had to generate an embed token. So anytime you're using app owns data, you need to generate embed tokens. And the developer controls what permissions are extended to the user for embedding purposes. And you might give one user an embed token with view permissions and another user an embed token with edit permissions. And one important principle here is that with app owns data, Power BI knows nothing about your users and can't give you any type of authorization policy. It's all up to you in your code. So the idea is that when you generate embed tokens, you have to decide what type of permissions, what type of resources to extend to that particular user. The other thing is generating embed tokens in production requires dedicated capacities. So you can use an A SKU, an EM SKU, or a P SKU. For development, you can work in a shared capacity, but the idea is any type of production usage, is going to require a dedicated capacity and not running in the shared capacity. Now, another thing that complicates embed tokens is we gave you one way to do it at the beginning, what we're going to call the Embed Token V1 API, and then we came up with a different set of classes to give you more flexibility, and we'll call that the Embed Token V2 API. I apologize for our naming because we didn't introduce V2 API for embed tokens until V3 of the API itself. So our names, could be better, and we're going to see V2 at the end of the session. But the idea here is that you get whatever embedding data you need for the report, you generate an embed token, you return that back to the caller. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do, and I'll go through this one pretty quickly, is we're going to add in the JavaScript required. And I'm going to keep this really simple. So given the fact that we have the report ID, it's GUID, and we have the embed URL that we got from calling into the Power BI service, and we have the embed token, well, what we're going to do is now pass that back to a page. And at first, we're also going to kind of keep things simple. We have a JavaScript library, but what we'll do is we'll simply add in the JavaScript library as, a CDN reference. So we're just kind of pulling it live. And then finally, we'll add some code into embed.js. Now, let's say that we go back over here. And so what I'm going to do now is let me open up the solution for exercise 4. And as we open the solution to exercise 4, just like you saw on the slide, if I go into my view, for this embed page, all we're really doing is we're adding a JavaScript library for the Power BI JavaScript API. We're adding a global variable called viewModel, and then we're going to add our embed.js. And then inside of our project, we'll have embed.js, and here's kind of the hello world of the API. So let's say that we start this thing up, and as I start this thing up, now we will sign in. And once again, the core application doesn't allow the user to see a report embedded if it's an anonymous user. The user has to be authenticated. Okay, so we'll go ahead, click embed. And so now what's going to happen is we get to the page. Also note that if I go ahead and I look at the page source, somewhere down here, you are going to have the embed URL and the embed token, on the page. And, you don't want the bad guy getting something bad. don't put anything bad in the embed token. So the embed token is definitely meant for you to push back to the browser and control, exactly what can be done with it. The other thing you can kind of see here is my code right here. If I go and we kind of take a look at the view model, my code kind of passed this back so the client-side JavaScript code can get the embed URL, the report token. And, as you can see here, if you've worked with Power BI embedding, this is pretty basic JavaScript code to embed the report. You can go much further with this. Okay, so this is not a session we're going to drill down on the, what can be done with the JavaScript API. We had a session a couple months back. We have an hour-long video to really drill down on the Power BI JavaScript API, which was our October Dev Camp session from last year. Okay. Now, what we can see is that we got 3 more sections here. So I want to make sure I give them all at least a little bit of time. This next section is going to be taking your project and moving your project from working with just JavaScript to being able to program in TypeScript. Now, as you go through the lab, let's move back here. And what you're going to see here, actually for this one, maybe I'll go to, well, let's say that I go to exercise 5. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And so in exercise 5, one of the things that we do is we have you configure your project so that it's a Node.js project. And that's what we're going to use to get this TypeScript support. So first of all, we have you add in a package.json file. The package.json file brings in some other utilities. We're going to pull in jQuery. We're going to pull in the Power BI JavaScript API. And we're also going to pull in something called Webpack, which is going to be helpful to us. Now, the 2 other files I have you pull in is the tsconfig.json file, which is just about the TypeScript compiler settings. And then another important thing, which is called Webpack. And the idea of Webpack, it's a utility that allows you to take TypeScript and bundle it into a JavaScript file for distribution. Now, what's going to happen is that, the first time that you run this, you're going to have to say npm install. And the idea is that when you call npm install, you're going to download all the Node.js packages, to the Node modules folder. Now that you've done that, let's look at package.json and notice there's one command in the script section, which is the build command, which is simply going to call Webpack. So when I want to call Webpack, let's go back up here. And so if I do a npm run, and then what's the name of that script command? It's build. Watch what's going to happen. We're going to run the Webpack command. So in the lab, what we're going to have you do is add a new TypeScript file into services. Into scripts. And so here, is the JavaScript. I take that back. I am going to this top level folder here, which is, okay, this is the file that I wanted. So, here is the TypeScript file. And the idea of what we're doing is, let's go to where we're generating this file. And if I go to www and we go look at the embed.js file, in fact, let's go ahead and delete the embed.js file. And now let's run that command again. And what you can see is that every time you run Webpack, it's going to take your JavaScript and it's going to rebuild this embed.js file. Okay, now a couple things to note here, about working with this support. Once again, there was a lot of details I went through. The lab will kind of step you through all the details. But the idea is you need these 3 main files, to add Node.js support, and then we're going to npm install to basically generate all the different things. And then what's really neat about using Webpack is that final file, embed.js, Webpack is actually going to pull all the code it needs from the jQuery library and the powerbi.js library and put it right into embed.js. So now you don't have any dependencies on having to link to any external JavaScript library files. So there's a lot of benefit your code can be a lot smaller, and your code gets rid of linked dependencies, and you know that it has a version of jQuery and Power BI that you tested with. So once again, it's using Webpack can be a very helpful thing. And at the very end, we also have you put the command into the CS proj file. So anytime that you run, it will do a build. So after you put this together, let's say that I come back here and I now am going to open up exercise 5, and I'll open up exercise 5 in here. And just to kind of remind you, if I take a look at this CS proj file, and if I open up this CS proj file right here, you can kind of see it has an npm post run. So what's kind of neat about this is that here's your JavaScript code that you're going to be working with. And let's say I do a console.log, and then we'll just put some type of a message in here. I know my mom's watching today. Hi, Mom. And the idea is that now every time you hit the F5 key, or you do a rebuild, it's going to automatically click in, and it's going to take your TypeScript and basically, rebuild, that particular JavaScript file for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this right here. And now if we, go through the embed process, what we should see is that we get to the embed page, it does the embed page, and there's the TypeScript that I have behind here. So there's really no change in the application between 4 and 5, but you've moved from JavaScript to TypeScript. And if you've done any degree of programming in TypeScript, I think you definitely would prefer it over having to do, regular JavaScript programming, because some of the nice aspects of it is that now your client-side code can be strongly typed. If you've never programmed in TypeScript, it's a lot like C# or Java, far more like those two languages than it is like JavaScript. But being able to, put strong typing, being able to get much better IntelliSense, being able to get compile time type checks reported, in a much more robust way, is definitely a big benefit. Okay, now as you move to the final lab, let's go do this. Let's say that I go back here and I want to move to this final exercise solution right here. And what I have you do is, adding a bunch more code, into both the server-side logic and the client-side logic. But let me just go ahead and run this. But the idea of the final exercise is that now when you go to the embed page, the application now is going to be able to see different workspaces. And let's go back to Power BI right here. So notice that I've got different workspaces right here. And which one can this application see? Anyone where it's been added, as a admin or as a member, to the workspace membership. So now this user, can move from, one workspace to another. And, here's one of the things to think about is that, as you move from workspace to workspace, can every user see everything? And by default, that is the case. So once again, you having to kind of build some type of authorization layer is important. Now, the way this application is built is that we have this view model. And the idea is that we're just going to pass this view model back to the browser. And so the view model is going to have a section of workspaces inside here, because we want to be able to kind of drop down and show the user what workspaces they can move to. We also, need, once we get to a workspace, having the different reports in there, so that the user, is able to click on a report, and move to that report. Also, you can see that we've added data sets, and you can't really embed a data set, but you could create a new report. And when you do it, you layer it on top of a data set, not a particular report. So for instance, if I click a data set, it then embeds a brand new report, and gives this user, the ability now to, add something inside to this particular model. And now that we have created this, let's go ahead and do a save as, and we'll save this as something that I would name it in my company, Bob the report. But now here you can kind of see that you've created this experience where the user can be a full-fledged content creator and content author, being able to embed and then allows some users, to be able to enter edit mode and decide that other users, can't enter edit mode. Okay, now we have a little over 10 minutes left. So what I just kind of showed you was, the part of the lab that you'll get to at the end. Two more things I want to talk about. One is multi-resource embed tokens. So multi-resource embed tokens, it's simply an embed token that doesn't just have one report inside of it, but maybe has 2 or 3 reports. Or in our case, it's going to have every report and every data set in a particular workspace. So here we are now going to work with the V2 embed token APIs. And notice that these are the ones that have the funky V2 in their name. And it wasn't until we released version 3 of the .NET SDK that we added the V2 API. So once again, we wish we could have done that better, but hopefully I'll make this clear here. So here's an example of the code that you have in the last exercise. Once we get to a workspace, what we're going to do is we're going to find all the data sets. And so we're going to enumerate through all the data sets and create one of these generate token request V2 dataset objects. We'll do the same thing, enumerate through all the reports. In this case right here, we don't really need a target workspace. However, if you create a particular report and then you'd like to save it back to a different workspace, that capability, is achievable, if you add that other target workspace, into your embed token. Okay, so once again, embed tokens get to be, very important. Okay, now the last thing I want to do is talk about using app owns data. That's been what we've talked about. But I hear more and more of our customers that are getting going with app owns data that are kind of confused about role level security and how to use it. So that's the last topic we're going to address. So what is role level security? It's a security scheme for Power BI data sets where we create name roles. For instance, in our case, we're going to use Central Region Sales, Eastern Region Sales. And then for every name role, you're able to add where clauses in the form of DAX table filter expressions. And the idea is that you have to be in at least one role to see data. And so if you're in multiple roles, you get an aggregation of data. And then also quite often we create a role and put no constraints on it. So if I put someone in that role, they can basically see, all the data. Now, many people, falsely assume that role level security only works out of the box with the Power BI service or with user owns data embedding. It absolutely works, with app owns data. You just have to do a little bit more work when you generate the embed token. So when you generate the embed token, you're able to add an inner object, which is known as the effective identity. Now, the effective identity, you can pass the username. You're able to list the data sets. So your effective identity will also have to list the GUID of each data set it wants to use. And it can specify the roles. If you ever try to open or embed a report with role level security with an embed token that doesn't have effective identity or doesn't have any of the roles, it will fail. So just if you're troubleshooting reports and you can't get it to load, one quick check is to say, is there role level security? Well, let's get rid of that and let's get another report that doesn't have role level security so we don't have to add this extra support in there. Okay, now I have a demo that I'm going to show here. Now, with this particular demo, once again, there is a application that I'm going to show, and there is a GitHub sample repo for this right here. And now that you have that, we'll make sure this gets listed in the chat window there. But what I want to do is let's go ahead and open this thing up and kind of demo through how it's going to work. Now, whenever you start implementing security, in an app owns data application, it kind of starts with, who is your identity provider? And generally your identity provider, which in many cases will not be Azure AD, you'll have to figure out who the user is and what roles the user might be in. Now, in our case right here, I have gone, into Azure AD, and I'm using an Azure AD application. We have a couple different users right here, but more importantly, I've created these different groups. So for role level security, we've created Azure AD groups for Central, Eastern, Western. I've created one other group that won't be for role level security, but it will just be for a switch to, should this user be able to go into edit mode. Now, one other thing that I did is that with Azure AD applications, there's this behavior that you don't get by default. And that is, if I go back to our application and there's something called token configuration, we can add something that says, when we send an access token, back to the user and an ID token, we want to add claims that will have GUIDs, for each of the roles. And I'm using GUIDs here. Notice that with Azure AD, I could switch that to, the friendly name of the group. But the idea here is that now, inside of my application, let's go into our controllers. I can start figuring out, which users are in what roles. So in our case right here, I'm just kind of hard coding the IDs, the claims. So maybe it's not the most polished way. The most polished way is probably to create your own database with user profiles to start filling out your authorization schema. But in our case right here, we're just going to take each user and say, which of these three groups is that user in? And then we're going to take those roles and we're simply going to add them to an array. Also, there's this, can the user customize the report? So is the user in this one group, yes or no? Okay, now let's go ahead and start up this application. So I'm going to go ahead and start up this application, and let's kind of see how it, does our role level security. So first thing, I will sign in, as me. And if I go to user info, you can see that, I'm in the role for Central Region and Eastern Region. I'm also in this report customizers group. So what's going to happen, when I try to see the report, we're going to put, those two roles, into that security token that goes back and forth. Okay, if I go back here and filters, let's turn on the filters and run filter now. And the idea here is that when we create the token right here, here I am creating the multi-resource embed token. There's the data set. There are the two different roles that are baked inside, and that comes back, back inside the token. Okay, and that's why this user can see those. Now let's sign out and sign in, as a different user. Okay, so this time we'll get back on there. We'll use a different account. I think we have our buddy Austin P. Is one of our users here. We'll go ahead. We'll jump inside there. So now what group is this user in? This user is only in Western Region. So once again, if I go back to this code right here, you can see that it's our controller that's discovering, what role that user is in. However, if we go to, the custom code in the Power BI Service API, what we're going to do is we're going to take the roles and we're just basically going to generate a token, with those role names inside of it. Here I am creating the effective identity. Here's the username. Here's the set of data sets. There's only one, but it is an array of data set GUIDs. And then here are the roles. Okay, now also notice that I have this customization enabled. So let's say that we go back here and this user now doesn't have customization enabled. So what you can see here is that this user can open up this report, and hopefully it will be there in a second. Come on, let's go. Let me go ahead and just give it one more quick little flash there. But you can see that this user cannot customize. So two things I want to point out about this. One, is if we go to this particular view, embed with RLS, we're only going to give you, these buttons, if customization is enabled. However, that in and of itself isn't really security, because a user can certainly do something, such as go to the browser, talk to the report, switch into view, into edit mode. So what's more important here is that we look if customization is enabled, and then when we build the embed token, if customization is enabled, I will return back to this user a token with edit permissions, if not only view. So once again, it's what you pass back, to the browser that matters when it comes to security. Okay, so at this point, I've kind of now been through, the things that we wanted to talk about, and I'm now going to look to see if there are questions that we might be able to go through at this point. On a premium capacity, does a service principal need a pro license? And the answer is no. And the other answer is a service principal cannot be assigned Power BI licensing. So users have licenses, but service principals do not, at least with respect to Power BI licensing. Another thing to note is that several people have asked if I have this Power BI premium per user, can I use service principal there? And the answer is no. So premium per user is really all about giving more advantages to users. So the service principal would still have to go to an A SKU, at a minimum. Okay, are the sample exercises developed in .NET and VS Code that are being shown available anywhere? Yes, we have the, just to make sure everybody is clear on that, if I go to GitHub, but there's the first place I would start, because this has all the files. And if you kind of read the start page here, here's download the Word document with the instructions or download PDF. Here you can download the files that you need. So just to give you a walkthrough, let's say I wanted to download the docx file. That's going to open up this Word document. There are the instructions that we have inside here. How many pages? Oh my God, there's 40 pages of stuff. It's going to take me over 10 minutes to do this. And then here are the student files as well. So hopefully that will give you a good head start. And I'm encouraging as many people as possible, either to do the labs from scratch, or at least, run the script that creates the configuration file for Azure AD application, and just open up the solutions and run those as well.
Thank you very much for all of your knowledge that you've shared with the community today. I wanted to thank everyone on the chat for all of your very thoughtful questions. And if there's any outstanding questions we didn't get to, make sure to check out the blog post that will be following shortly after next week. And make sure to visit Power BI community at community.powerbi.com. And we will have the video up there as well. Thank you again, Ted.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for helping, for hosting.
My pleasure. All right. Have a good day, everyone. Good evening and good morning.
Happy embedding. Cheers.